Celeste felt their eyes on her long before she saw them. It was that sixth sense, the one that had once saved her life in the FBI and had now become her only weapon in a city where danger lurked behind fake smiles and empty police promises. She sat in her parked car at the curb, watching the street as pedestrians flowed like raindrops on glass. People stepped out of stores, chatting with each other, crossing the street, pushing strollers, but in this tide of faces, two stood out like a splinter beneath the skin. They weren't trying to blend in. On the contrary, they moved with purpose, too measured, too aware, like hunters waiting for the perfect moment to strike. One of them, tall and wiry, with a cleanly shaved head and a tattoo of a snake's tail curling up his neck, looked older and far more dangerous. He was the one they called Casper, the right hand of men who preferred to keep their hands clean but never missed a chance to remind others of their power. The second was younger, but he carried the same arrogant confidence Celeste had seen in those who thought they were untouchable far too soon. Her fingers unconsciously tightened on the steering wheel, but her expression remained calm. They were looking for her. That much was certain. She adjusted the side mirror as if fixing it, using the movement to watch as Casper spoke to his companion, gesturing in her direction. Their pace slowed for a moment as if they were reconsidering, but then the hesitation vanished. They crossed the street. Celeste felt her heartbeat steady, a dull echo in her chest like the calm before a gunshot. The golden brown of her skin caught the streetlight's glow, and she knew that men like Casper saw more than just a threat in her. They saw a black woman who didn't know her place, and that infuriated them more than anything else. Her hand slid toward the glove compartment, where her gun rested, but she didn't rush. These men weren't here just to approach her. They wanted to see her falter, to make her nervous, to let her know she was being watched. They wanted to do what they'd done to so many others, make her feel vulnerable. But Celeste Hall was not a woman who knew fear. She had seen war from the other side. She knew what real danger smelled like. And she understood that when hunters begin their game, they don't just want to see fear, they want surrender. She met their gaze like she was lining up a target in her scope, calm, steady, unwavering. Casper smirked. His companion glanced away, and in that moment, everything changed. Celeste opened the door, stepping out of the car. Celeste knew that the truth could never stay buried forever, no matter how much money, power, or intimidation those in control wielded. She had seen schemes like this before during her time in the FBI, but back then, she had a badge, cover, and at least some institutional backing, even if corruption ran deep. Now, she was on her own, without official authority, without protection, but with the same skills and the same relentless drive. She started the way she always had, by gathering information. A few calls, a few conversations with people who knew their voices would never be heard by law enforcement, and the picture became clear. Attacks like the one on Jaden were not isolated. The difference was that most victims vanished without a trace. Young black men and women with no connections, no safety net, plucked off the streets, while their families remained silent, too afraid to fight back, knowing that the police would never come looking for them. To the system, they were nothing more than statistics. Jaden, the young man she had saved, was more than just a random target. He knew more than he was willing to say at first, but after a few meetings, after realizing Celeste wasn't going to disappear like everyone else who had tried to ask questions, he finally gave her a name, Casper. That name carried weight, a ghost that moved between the city's underbelly and the people who thought they ran it. Casper wasn't just some street thug, he was an enforcer, someone who made sure that fear remained exactly where it was supposed to, embedded deep into the bones of those who weren't meant to fight back. And he worked for someone with far more influence than just the shadows. As Celeste dug deeper, tension in the city began to rise. It was subtle at first, glances that lingered too long when she walked into certain places, phones hanging up the moment she asked the wrong questions, people who once agreed to meet suddenly deciding they had nothing to say. The police, predictably, remained silent. Reports of missing people were filed and ignored. Complaints of harassment were brushed aside. Celeste had expected this, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. The city wasn't broken, it was designed this way. Those with power had built it to ensure people like her had no way of changing it. She needed someone who could amplify what she found, someone who couldn't be silenced as easily as frightened locals or beaten-down families. That's where Victoria Brooks came in. A journalist who had spent her career exposing the filth that people in power wanted to keep hidden, Victoria was one of the few people Celeste still trusted. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Celeste had been forced to leave the bureau, but when she called, Victoria listened. She always did. After a long pause, the journalist simply said, "Meet me." Their conversation was short but intense. Celeste laid out what she knew: missing black youth, ignored police reports, and a name that kept surfacing: Casper. Victoria, always quick, always sharp, didn't waste time on disbelief. She had been tracking similar disappearances, trying to find a common thread, but her sources had gone silent one by one. Celeste's information was the missing piece she needed, but even she hadn't connected it to what Celeste uncovered next: the man behind it all. Adam Drake. His name was everywhere, if you knew where to look. A respected businessman, a political figure who hid behind carefully curated rhetoric about traditional values and preserving communities. He wasn't a criminal in the way Casper was. He didn't dirty his hands. He let others do that for him while he stood on podiums, shaking hands and making speeches. But the money, the connections, it all led back to him. He was the one funding it, profiting from it, keeping the system in place. Celeste had spent years tracking criminals who operated in the dark, but the most dangerous ones always stood in the light. And she was going to drag this one straight into the fire. Celeste knew this moment would come. If you wanted to take down a monster, sooner or later, you had to look straight into its jaws. She stood at the entrance of an unmarked building, tucked away among abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. The security guard at the door barely spared her a glance before stepping aside. Her appearance didn't raise suspicion. A black dress, high heels, a careless wave in her hair, she looked like just another guest looking for a good time, not a hunter stepping into the den of predators. This was a world where money dictated everything, and people were nothing more than commodities. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and expensive liquor, the dim lighting designed to blur reality. Men in tailored suits, women draped in dresses barely long enough to be called clothing, laughter that was too loud, too forced. No one made eye contact. Celeste moved through the crowd, feigning amusement, pretending to belong, her senses sharp as a blade. She didn't need to ask where it was happening. She followed the tension, the subtle shift in energy that told her where the real business was taking place. Past the velvet curtains, the atmosphere shifted. A raised platform, a row of chairs arranged in a semicircle, and a heavy silence that settled over the room like a weighted blanket. At the center stood a man with a microphone, his expression neutral, his voice smooth as he began listing off qualities like he was selling cattle. But it wasn't cattle. It was people. Young black women, barely adults, lined up on display, their wrists bound, their eyes hollow. Rage burned in Celeste's chest, a tight, suffocating fire she had to choke down. One wrong move and she'd be next in line. She memorized faces: who was bidding, who was watching, who was in charge. And then she saw him. Casper, standing at the edge of the room, overseeing everything with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't looking in her direction, yet. She turned slightly, angling herself away, reaching for the small device tucked beneath the fabric of her dress. A quick press of her fingers, and the tiny camera embedded in her necklace began recording. Evidence. The kind no one could ignore. Then she made a mistake. A hand brushed against hers as she moved, a man leaning too close, his cologne chokingly strong. "Haven't seen you here before," he murmured, his breath heavy with whiskey. She forced a smile, slipping past him with practiced ease, but the damage was done. Casper's head lifted. His eyes met hers. Recognition was immediate. His expression didn't change, but his posture did. His fingers twitched, a signal she had seen before. The men at the door shifted. Time slowed. She turned, heading for the nearest exit, her heartbeat steady even as adrenaline flooded her veins. Footsteps behind her. Voices, low and sharp. Movement. She spun as the first man lunged, sidestepping, twisting his arm as she slammed his head into the nearest wall. No time to hesitate. She ran. through the hallway, down a flight of stairs. Behind her, Casper barked orders, the sound of pursuit closing in. She burst through the side door into the night air, heels snapping against pavement as she sprinted into the darkness. Gunshots. Too close. She ducked, weaving between cars, shoving through an alleyway, her pulse a war drum in her ears. She had seconds. Her car was around the corner. She reached it, yanked the door open, and threw herself inside. Tires screeched as she tore out of the lot, headlights slicing through the night. In the mirror, figures emerged from the alley. Casper, standing still as the others chased in vain. He knew she'd be back. And now they knew her face. She wasn't just hunting them anymore. She was their target. Victoria sat at her computer, fingers flying over the keyboard as she scrolled through a flood of documents, reports, bank transactions, and phone records, each revealing the filth the authorities had tried to bury, money flowing in a steady stream, the same names appearing over and over again, but the biggest one of them all was Adam Drake, the man who built his career on traditional values and honest leadership, but in reality he was running an entire network stretching from the streets to corporate offices, bought cops, silent judges, reporters looking the other way. This wasn't just a corrupt system, it was a well-oiled machine where the police weren't just turning a blind eye, they were part of it, covering up assaults, kidnappings, and human trafficking. Victoria scanned the figures and realized they were erasing trails long before anyone could ask questions. Complaints disappeared, witnesses kept quiet, and they got away with it every time. The phone rang, the sharp tones slicing through the room. Celeste knew instantly something was wrong. On the other end was a voice soaked in panic. Jaden, he was gone, he wasn't at home, he wasn't anywhere. He had vanished, his apartment door had been kicked in, his belongings scattered. No one saw anything, no one heard anything, but Celeste knew this wasn't random. This was a message, a warning, a reminder that she wasn't untouchable. They had taken him not because he was a threat, but because he was connected to her, and now, if she didn't move fast, he would disappear like all the others. She didn't hesitate, every instinct told her where to look. She drove through the back streets, the city blurring past her, her mind running through everything she knew, patterns, locations, movement, and then it hit her. The warehouse, the one that kept coming up in reports, always mentioned in passing, a location out in the countryside, off the books, outside of jurisdiction, a perfect holding spot for people who were never meant to be found. She gripped the wheel tighter, her jaw clenched. They had Jaden, if they had the others, that's where they would be. The warehouse loomed in the darkness, massive and silent, tucked between empty fields and forgotten roads. She killed the engine, listening, waiting. The air was thick with tension. She moved carefully, her footsteps light, her breath steady. She didn't need a gun to know how to fight, but she also wasn't foolish enough to think this would be easy. She reached a side door. The lock was new, the chain heavy, but it wasn't a challenge, a quick movement, a silent crack, and she was in, slipping through the narrow gap like a shadow. Inside, the space was cold, metallic, the hum of generators low but steady, the scent of oil and sweat thick in the air. She moved between crates and stacks of supplies, every sense alert. Then she heard it, voices, low, sharp, commanding, and then something worse, a whimper. Someone was there, not just Jaden, but others. She pressed against a metal beam, angling herself for a clear view, and what she saw made her stomach turn. A group of people huddled together, hands bound, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear, and standing in front of them, barking orders, was Casper. Her pulse slowed, focused. She needed to think, needed to act. She could take out one or two guards, but there were too many. She had no backup, no escape route planned. Then a misstep, the faintest creak beneath her foot, but it was enough. Casper's head snapped in her direction, his expression shifting from businesslike indifference to something darker. Find her. His voice echoed, and just like that, the chase began. She ran, slipping between the shadows, dodging hands that reached for her, adrenaline turning every movement razor sharp. She was fast, but they knew the terrain. She slammed through a side door, feet pounding against gravel as gunfire cracked through the night. She zigzagged, diving between storage containers, pushing herself harder. Her car was too far. She needed cover, needed distance, needed time. But then she heard it. Move them out, now. Casper wasn't chasing, he was redirecting, and that's when she understood they were transferring the captives, not just hiding them, but moving them somewhere no one would ever find them, and if she didn't act fast, they'd be gone for good. Celeste wasn't about to leave Jaden and the others in the hands of these men. She couldn't, not after everything she had uncovered, not after seeing the terror in the eyes of those who knew they were being sold like cattle while the police, bought and paid for, did nothing. She had spent years fighting inside the system, believing in justice, believing in rules, but this wasn't about rules anymore, this was survival. And the only way to win was to break the game entirely, so she crafted a plan. Precise, ruthless, one that didn't rely on hope or chance but on the one thing she knew better than them, strategy. She spent hours studying the warehouse, its patterns, its weak points, every entrance, every blind spot, every shift change. She couldn't do this alone, but she also couldn't trust anyone within the system, which left her only one ally, Victoria, the journalist who had risked everything just by listening. Together they built something that couldn't be ignored. Victoria fed the press enough information to stir outrage, enough to make people ask questions, but not enough for the authorities to shut it down before it spread. It was a fire that couldn't be contained, and while the world was distracted by the growing scandal, Celeste moved into position. The warehouse was at its busiest during transport, men loading trucks, finalizing payments, checking manifests like this was any other business transaction, and in a way, it was, except the cargo was human lives. She waited until the moment when their guard was at its lowest, when they were too focused on numbers and logistics to notice a single shadow slipping through the chaos. She had no backup, no badge, no jurisdiction, but she had one advantage. They didn't expect someone like her to fight. But the first explosion was small, controlled, a detonation set inside one of the trucks, enough to cause panic but not enough to hurt anyone. Alarms blared, men shouted, scrambling to assess the damage, and that's when she moved, cutting through the confusion like a knife, disabling guards one by one, striking hard, fast, efficient. She had spent years training for missions that required precision, and this was no different, except now. The people she was saving weren't foreign assets or political figures. They were victims, people discarded by a world that deemed them unworthy of saving. She reached the holding area, broke the locks, her voice low but firm as she directed the captives out. Jaden was there, bruised but alive, disbelief flashing in his eyes when he saw her, but there was no time for questions, no time for relief, because the second explosion went off, a final distraction before the real fight began. Casper was already moving, barking orders, rallying his men, and when his gaze locked onto her, she knew this wasn't just business for him anymore, this was personal. Gunfire erupted, bullets slicing through the air as Celeste ducked behind crates, ushering the freed captives toward the emergency exit she had mapped out. The plan had never been to win a battle, just to get them out, and as the sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, she knew Victoria's plan had worked. The press had forced the authorities to show up, but the question was, would they do anything? The answer came in seconds, as police stormed the warehouse, weapons drawn, orders shouted, but instead of arresting the traffickers, they stood down as if waiting for orders from someone who wasn't there. Casper smirked, relaxed, because he knew, just as she did, that the system was never meant to protect people like Jaden. The system was built for men like him, and in that moment, Celeste understood. Justice wouldn't come through laws, through courts, through bureaucratic processes designed to fail people like her. It would come through her own hands, through her own fight, and from this point on, she wasn't just exposing them, she was dismantling them, piece by piece, until none of them were left standing. Victoria didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't rest until she uncovered exactly how deep Adam Drake's corruption ran, her fingers flying over her keyboard, sifting through shell companies, anonymous donations, and political alliances until the pattern became undeniable. Drake wasn't just a businessman funding human trafficking for profit, he was bankrolling ultra-right-wing groups that weren't just violent but were actively pushing legislation designed to strip rights away from black communities. His name never appeared directly, of course, but the money trails were there, subtle, well hidden, funneled through seemingly innocent initiatives, but they all led back to him. This wasn't just about money or power, this was ideology, and that made him more dangerous than she had imagined. Celeste didn't have the luxury of being surprised. She had known men like him before, men who smiled for cameras while pulling the strings of the worst monsters in society. She needed something concrete, something that couldn't be ignored or spun, and that's when she found him, the weak link, a middleman in Drake's network, a man with enough knowledge to bring everything crashing down. He was scared, twitchy, a man who had spent too long knowing too much and was finally ready to talk. Celeste met him in a parking garage, the air thick with gasoline fumes and paranoia. He handed her a flash drive, his hands shaking, whispering that he had proof, bank statements, emails, conversations that could bury Drake. But before she could ask another question, he froze, his breath hitched, and then, gunfire. Celeste barely had time to react as his body jerked back. 3 shots, clean, professional, a sniper's kill. She dropped to the ground, her pulse spiking as she scanned the area. Nothing, no movement, no silhouette, just silence and the distant hum of city traffic. They had been watching, they had known, and they had sent a message. She didn't hesitate, grabbing the flash drive from his lifeless fingers and sprinting for cover, adrenaline burning through her veins. By the time she reached her car, tires screeched behind her, black SUVs, tinted windows, closing in too fast. She slammed her foot on the gas, weaving through the streets, knowing that whoever was after her wasn't some street thug with a gun. These were professionals, and now, they were hunting her. Victoria was waiting when she arrived, her face pale as Celeste threw the flash drive onto the table. She plugged it in, scrolling through the files, her eyes widening with every document she opened. "This is it," she whispered. But Celeste wasn't convinced. The system was rigged, evidence alone wouldn't stop men like Drake. She had seen it too many times. They would twist it, bury it, make it disappear, and she was right, because hours later, Drake was on television, standing at a podium, his voice calm, controlled, playing the part of the victim. "These false accusations are nothing more than a politically motivated attack on me and my family," he declared, smiling for the cameras. "We will not be intimidated, we will fight back." Celeste watched in disgust as the headlines shifted, the media framing him as the persecuted, as a man under siege by radicals trying to destroy him, and the worst part? It was working. This wasn't a battle that could be won with truth alone. She had thought exposing them would be enough, but it wasn't. The system was built to protect them, not the people they hurt. She had spent her life fighting within the rules, believing in justice, but now, justice wasn't enough. She needed action, real action, and that meant one thing. If the system wouldn't take Drake down, then she would. Celeste knew that the only way to bring down a monster like Drake wasn't through the law but through chaos, through disruption, through turning his own people against him. She had spent years working cases that touched the underworld. She knew the rules, knew that loyalty in crime was a myth, that the right amount of pressure, the right whispered rumor, could make even the strongest alliances crumble. She reached out to old contacts, people who owed her, people who didn't fear the law but feared losing money. She planted the seed. Drake wasn't paying his people what they deserved. He was planning to cut them loose, to disappear before the storm hit, and within days, his network started to fracture, trust eroding as suspicion took hold, and that was exactly what she needed to make her next move. She struck one of his operations in the dead of night, a storage facility hidden behind the front of an import business, a place where records were kept, where deals were written in ink before being washed away in blood. She moved fast, taking out security with brutal efficiency, her body a weapon honed from years of training. She reached the archive room, setting fire to every document she could find, knowing that even if the law wouldn't act on evidence, erasing it would cripple Drake's ability to function. Alarms blared, the fire spread, and then she heard the voice she had been waiting for, Casper. He emerged from the smoke, gun in hand, his eyes filled with something darker than hatred. He wasn't just here to stop her, he wanted revenge. "You ruined everything," he snarled, circling her like a predator. "You think this ends with me? Drake will always have another soldier." Celeste didn't hesitate, lunging before he could fire. The fight was brutal, unforgiving, fists connecting, bodies colliding, each of them fueled by something deeper than survival. This wasn't just a fight for information, it was a reckoning. They crashed through the shelves, knocking over crates, sparks flying as the flames consumed the room around them. Casper got a hand around her throat, slamming her against the wall, but Celeste was faster, twisting free, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the ground and driving it into his neck. He staggered back, choking, blood pooling between his fingers, his eyes filled with disbelief. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped. Then finally, a whisper, "Drake? He's leaving, you'll never catch him." Then he was gone, collapsing to the ground as the fire roared around them. Celeste pressed a hand to her side, feeling the warmth of her own blood soaking through her clothes, the pain sharp, deep, but she had no time for it. She stumbled toward the exit, dragging herself out of the burning building just as the roof collapsed behind her. Victoria wasted no time, publishing everything they had, the leaked documents, the financial records, the testimonies. It was undeniable proof of Drake's empire, his crimes exposed for the world to see, but the world didn't work the way it was supposed to. The headlines screamed, the outrage spread, but Drake was still free, too powerful, too protected, too deeply embedded in the very system that was supposed to stop men like him. And as Celeste sat in the dim glow of Victoria's apartment, blood drying on her skin, the pain in her ribs a dull reminder that she had won a battle but not the war, she realized something. The law wasn't coming for Adam Drake, so she would. Adam Drake was running, and Celeste wasn't going to let him get away. He had built an empire on blood and corruption, played the system like a rigged game, walked free while countless lives were destroyed in his name, but now he was scared, now he was fleeing, and that meant he knew he had lost. Victoria had done her part, pulling flight records, tracking Drake's movements, piecing together his exit strategy. He wasn't taking chances. A private jet, last-minute clearance, a discreet airstrip. Outside the city, everything arranged to make him vanish before the world could catch up, but Celeste wasn't the world, and she wasn't bound by its rules. She had one shot, one chance, and failure wasn't an option. She drove fast, the city lights bleeding into the darkness behind her as she left civilization behind. The road stretched ahead, empty, endless. But her mind was sharp, focused, replaying every detail, every angle. She knew the airstrip, had studied its layout, memorized its weak points. Drake would be surrounded, of course, mercenaries, ex-military, the kind of men who didn't ask questions as long as the money was good. But Celeste had fought better, had taken down worse, and tonight she wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting to finish this, to end it before he could disappear and start over somewhere else. The moment she reached the perimeter, she knew they were waiting. The guards weren't sloppy, their positioning was strategic, covering all exits, watching every angle, but they weren't expecting her to come in hot. She hit the gate at full speed, ramming through the flimsy barricade. Gunfire erupted as bullets shredded the air around her. She ducked low, gripping the wheel, her tires screaming as she swerved, braking hard, throwing the car sideways to use it as cover. She rolled out before the vehicle even stopped moving, landing hard, gun in hand. Two guards were already closing in. She moved first, dropping the first with a precise shot to the knee before finishing him with a strike to the temple. The second hesitated just long enough for her to grab his wrist, twist the gun from his grip, and slam his face into the hood of the car. No time to waste, she pushed forward, weaving between crates and fuel tanks. The air reeked of oil and adrenaline, shadows shifting as more men moved in, but she was faster, more ruthless, every movement calculated, every bullet counted. She took them down one by one, no hesitation, no mercy, because they wouldn't give her any either. The jet was already running, engines humming, the heat of the exhaust distorting the air. She could see him through the cockpit window, Drake, standing near the stairs, watching, waiting, calm, like he still believed he would win. She sprinted toward him, gun raised, but more guards emerged, blocking her path. She didn't stop. She slid under a stack of cargo, popping up on the other side with a shot that took down the nearest one. Another swung at her. She dodged, grabbed his arm, twisted. The sickening snap of bone drowned out by the roar of the jet. She could feel the heat from the turbines, the wind whipping around them. She was close, so close, and then Drake turned, stepping onto the stairs, his hand resting on the railing, smirking like the coward he was, like he still believed he could escape. Not this time. Celeste didn't slow down, didn't hesitate, didn't give Drake another second to escape because she knew men like him, knew the way they operated, always one step ahead, always with another plan, another bribe, another escape route. But this time, he had nowhere left to run. She sprinted toward the stairs of the jet, her muscles burning, her vision razor-sharp, but just as she was about to reach him, more gunfire erupted. She dove behind a crate, bullets slamming into metal, sparks flying. 3 more of his men closing in, well-trained, fast, but not fast enough. She rolled to the side, taking out the first one with a shot to the shoulder. The second lunged, knife flashing in the dim light. She twisted, catching his wrist, slamming his head into the stair rail. The third hesitated just a second too long, and Celeste put him down with a single, clean strike. Drake was almost inside the plane, but she was faster, grabbing his ankle just as he stepped onto the final stair, yanking him down. He hit the tarmac hard, groaning as she pinned him, her knee digging into his chest, gun pressed to his forehead, his breathing ragged, his suit stained with dirt and sweat, but he still smirked, still looked at her like she was nothing, like he had already won. "You won't pull that trigger," he whispered, voice low, arrogant, "because you're not like me." She wanted to, God, she wanted to end it right here, erase him from existence, but he was right. Killing him wouldn't destroy the system, it wouldn't fix anything, it would just make him a martyr for the monsters that followed him. So instead, she did something worse. She let him live. She stepped back, keeping her gun trained on him as sirens screamed in the distance, the night pulsing with the sound of approaching chaos. Drake sat up slowly, dusting himself off like he was adjusting his tie before a meeting. "The cops won't do a damn thing," he sneered. "You think I don't have judges, senators, CEOs in my pocket? This is a waste of time, sweetheart." But Celeste just smiled, because she had something better than handcuffs, better than any courtroom. She had the truth, and it was already out. Victoria had done what she did best. The video was live, streamed, shared, spreading like wildfire. Drake's own words, his own admissions, recorded from the files Celeste had stolen, his voice smooth, casual, talking about relocating assets and managing compliance like he wasn't discussing human lives. There was no spinning it, no PR campaign strong enough to erase it. The world was watching, and for the first time, the system had no choice but to act. The squad cars pulled up, officers pouring out, their guns drawn, their faces tight with the knowledge that this wasn't just another arrest. This was history. They cuffed him, forced him to his feet, and for the first time, the smirk cracked, his confidence wavered. He turned to Celeste, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you've won? I'll be out before you can blink." But she just stared at him, calm, unshaken. "No," she said, voice like steel, "you won't." Because this time, the evidence was ironclad. This time, there was no backroom deal, no erased files, no witnesses disappearing into the dark. This time, the monster didn't slip through the cracks, and as Drake was shoved into the back of the squad car, Celeste exhaled, the weight of the war still pressing on her shoulders, because she knew this wasn't the end. The system was still broken, still rotting from the inside. But for tonight, just tonight, one less predator walked free, and that was enough. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried the weight of history. The judge's voice steady, cold, final. "Adam Drake, you have been found guilty on all charges and are hereby sentenced to life without the possibility of parole." The words echoed, rippling through the room like a seismic shift. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed. The public had demanded justice, and today, for once, they got it. Celeste watched from the back, her expression unreadable, the air heavy. With the scent of polished wood and old paper, Drake sat motionless, his suit crisp, his posture composed. But his eyes, they betrayed him. Rage simmered beneath the surface. A man who had spent his life untouchable now shackled, a relic of a dying era. But Celeste knew better, knew that power like his didn't die in a courtroom, knew that while Drake was done, the machine that had built him was still turning, and outside these walls, his allies were already planning their next move. Victoria didn't stop, couldn't stop. While the world celebrated Drake's downfall, she was already 2 steps ahead, digging deeper, pulling at the threads he had left behind, the hidden accounts, the nameless investors, the politicians who had benefited from his empire. Her articles weren't just stories, they were weapons, each headline another blow against a system that had thrived in the shadows for too long. But with every truth exposed, the threats grew louder, anonymous messages, warnings. Disguised as concern, "You've done enough, let it go," but she never did. Because Victoria Brooks wasn't just a journalist, she was a soldier, and this was her battlefield. Jaden had changed, Celeste saw it in his eyes, the way they burned with something new, something relentless. He had always been sharp, quick with his words, but now there was purpose behind them, fire in his voice when he spoke about justice, about laws that were written to oppress rather than protect, about the people left behind. He had been broken once, stolen from the streets, stripped of control, but now he was taking it back. I'm going to law school, he told her one evening, the city. Lights casting shadows across his face. People like us, we don't just need to fight, we need to change the rules. Celeste had felt something then, something rare, something close to hope. But she wasn't built for courts, for politics, for slow battles fought with papers and policies. She had never been that kind of warrior. Her war was fought in alleys, in hidden rooms, in places where justice didn't reach. She had taken down one man, but there would be another, there was always another, and she had no illusions about what came next. This wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. She had burned a name into history. But the system didn't break in a day, it would take more, much more. And she was ready. Her phone buzzed, the sound slicing through the quiet of her apartment. She almost ignored it, exhaustion pressing down on her bones, but something made her reach for it. A new number, no caller ID, just a message, short, precise, weighted with meaning. You made the first move. Now it's our turn. She stared at the screen, her grip tightening. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting, stepping into the fight she had started, and for the first time in a long time, Celeste allowed herself the ghost of a smile, because the war wasn't over, but now, she wasn't fighting it alone.